Trumpets. One of my initial ideas when I started off manipulating fabric, and that was to basically take a prairie point and squash it, and you get the design that you can see both behind me and indeed in front. And all the shape is here is an inserted and squashed prairie point. So how do we do it? You're going to need 8 squares. I've got 4 squares in my background fabric and 4 squares in the colour. They're both exactly the same size. I happen to be using 6.5 inch squares, but it matters not the size. Leave the background squares to one side for the moment and take the remaining 4 coloured ones. And these are going to be folded in half, making a triangle, and then folded in half again. Now that is what is known as a prairie point. All right, it's folded twice on the diagonal. Now you will find that in many of my books Trumpets appears, and I very frequently tell you to baste, stitch with a long stitch all the way along the raw edges. That's entirely up to you if you wish to do this. It does hold the layers together, having a basted bottom, nothing like a basted bottom. What you do need to make sure of is when you have folded it in half once and then diagonally a second time, is get the 2 folds here flush. So unless you're going to baste its bottom, just put a pin in it to hold those folds really flush. Taking 2 of the background squares and 1 of these shapes, and just make sure you keep those folds nice and flush, pin it if necessary. It doesn't matter which way round the shape goes at this moment in time, it will a little later. Place the shape so all the raw edges are exactly aligned with the edge of the background square. Take the second background square, place it on top, and you are going to sew down this edge, trapping all those layers in the seam. When you come to sew down the edge here, please use 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now don't panic, 3/8 of an inch is readily sorted out because it may well say on your sewing machine 10, it might say 3/8, or it could well be the first line beside your presser foot. Why 3/8? The reason for sewing 3/8 is it gives you a chance to catch all of the layers in the seam. Also makes it a little bit easier when you come to put the block together. So 3/8 of an inch seam allowance down there, and as you can see I have trapped my shape in the seam, and there's still a seam allowance top and bottom. When you've done this once with 2 of the background squares, you're going to repeat it for a second time with another 2 background squares, so we end up with 2 pieces exactly the same. Once you've done that, I suggest you press the back seam open and flat, and the little end where there's a little nose, squash it downwards into the work, don't drag it back. Turn it to the right side and flatten the shape into a kite shape. So you should end up, when you've done both of them, with 2 pieces that look a little bit like this. Having got my 2 sets done with the kite shapes in them, you're going to put them together and put those remaining 2 prairie points in the seam. Now I suggest you have your kites point to point. So the opening is here and the opening is there. When you come to put the other 2 on, it's very easy to get this horribly wrong. Make sure that you lay them onto one half of the block so the opening is to the outside edge. And there's one of them laid on that side, and there's this one put on the other side. If you put the right hand side down first, then the left hand one on top, it means that as you sew across the centre, you're going with the flow, because what I suggest you do next is to make certain they absolutely snuggle up to each other here at the point of the barbecue skewer, there. This is no good if you do that. They're not snuggled up to each other, so get them really snuggled up. And all the raw edges together along there. I would put a couple of stitches just here to hold it. When you put a couple of stitches just there to hold it, we're going to put the block together, matching up the seam here with the point of the shape there. Now, because you press the seam open and flat, there's a little bit of help because you can see the top of the shape in the seam, and this is where you're going to sew exactly through. So line up the top of this point and the ones underneath, get them exactly together, and proceed along here using your 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Should you need to deviate to catch the top of that, then do a little bit of deviation and then come out back to your 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. With luck, when you open it out, all the points should be together in the middle as the sample here. And I'm not telling you how many of them I had to do to get that. So having stitched the block together, if the points don't line up, you could always put a button there. You could have a small button, or if they're not quite so good, you could have a slightly bigger button, or a bigger button, or if they're really awful, you could have an enormous button in the middle. But let's just pretend they're okay. At this stage now, I suggest you catch the corner of the trumpets down, so just literally put a couple of stitches in the corner to hold it in place. And you've got a little pocket, and of course if we've got a little pocket, we could put something in it. So let's put a folded square into the pocket. This is what's known as Somerset mitered or folded patchwork. This is where you fold a square into a rectangle, then you take the fold of the rectangle, you bring it to the middle, and the fold of the rectangle and you bring it to the center there. It makes like a little aircraft. Meow. What it would pay you to do is to put a couple of stitches here on the machine just to hold the entire thing together. And then it can be tucked into the pocket. But in order to put it firmly into the pocket and push it down a little bit, it would probably pay you to just give your little shape a haircut. So just cut the corners off. And then it can be inserted into the pocket. Because the lovely thing about trumpets is the edge rolls. And not only will this edge roll, but that edge will roll as well, as indeed will that one. Like the sample I now have in front of me, where I have rolled the edges around the trumpet and inserted the little shape. And indeed you can play with these things to your heart's content. So we can insert something, we can roll the edges, we can fold this bit back, and you can do whatever you happen to like. And with luck, at the end, if you choose, your block could end up looking something like this. Now the design you saw in the very beginning actually had a border of tucks around the outside edge, as I have on this one. And if you want to know about tucks, if you go on the YouTube, you put tucks in and my name, there's a very good YouTube video on how you actually make tucks, followed by a second one on adding embellishment to the edge of the tucks. And if you wanted to know a little bit more about the one I have here, which has some twisted tucks on it, and the fancy fandango, look for how to do a fancy fandango in French, because it's quite funny. So that's it. There is the trumpet block. Very simple. All it is inserted and squashed prairie points.